the powder keg before the first footstep hit the pavement. You have to understand the temperature of the room. This wasn't just another protest. It was a climax of a year that felt like a decade. For months, the American psyche had been hammered by a relentless 24-hour cycle of us versus them. Every dinner table was a potential battlefield. Every social media scroll was a minefield of outrage. The country wasn't just divided, it was exhausted. In the week leading up to that Tuesday, the airwaves were dominated by experts predicting the Great Collision. Two massive, opposing rallies had been scheduled for the same day, in the same square. The police had already erected steel kill zones to keep the factions apart. Business owners in downtown D.C. didn't just lock their doors. They spent thousands of dollars on heavy-duty plywood, boarding up windows as if a Category 5 hurricane was about to make landfall. The media didn't help. News anchors sat in climate-controlled studios, using words like civil war and unavoidable conflict as if they were reading the weather report. They weren't just reporting on the tension. They were feeding it. By 7 a.m. that morning, the National Mall looked more like a military staging ground than a park. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping through the humid air with a sound like a heartbeat. The non-event that changed everything at 8:45 a.m. The anticipated collision was supposed to begin. The cameras were live. The reporters had their helmets and gas masks slung over their shoulders, ready for the first canister of tear gas to fly. They were looking for the flags, the masks, the tactical gear, and the megaphones. They were looking for the noise, but the noise didn't come. Instead, at the edge of the police perimeter, a single man appeared. This is where the story truly begins. He wasn't the leader the media wanted. He didn't have a blue check mark next to his name. He was a 54-year-old retired teacher from Ohio named Elias. He wore a plain white cotton shirt, jeans that had seen better days, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. He didn't scream. He didn't wave his sign aggressively. He simply stood at the edge of the barricade, holding a piece of cardboard that looked like it had been cut from a grocery delivery box. On it, in simple black marker, were 5 words: "I am here to listen." The police officers, geared up in riot shields and heavy padding, looked at him with genuine confusion. They were trained to handle a charging crowd. They weren't trained to handle a man who looked like he was waiting for a bus. The ripple effect. Then, the quiet began to grow. From the shadows of the Smithsonian buildings and the side alleys of the business district, others began to join him. They didn't arrive in a shouting mass. They arrived in 2s and 3s. A nurse still in her scrubs, a veteran with a prosthetic leg, a college student holding the hand of a younger brother. There was no signal. There was no whistle. They simply lined up behind Elias. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't look at their phones. They just stood there, eyes fixed on the horizon, creating a human chain of absolute stillness. The silence was so sudden it felt like the sound had been cut out of a movie. The shouting agitators who had arrived early to start trouble suddenly found their voices trailing off. It is hard to stay at a level 10 of anger when the person 3 feet away from you is projecting a level 0 of peace. The walk begins at exactly 9 a.m. Elias took the first step. It wasn't a fast walk. It was a deliberate, rhythmic passe. Thud, 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 thud. As the line began to move, the sound of thousands of feet hitting the pavement in unison created a low-frequency vibration that you could feel in your chest. It was the sound of a giant waking up, but a giant that had no intention of fighting. As they passed the first line of news cameras, a reporter tried to shove a microphone into Elias's face. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice sounding unnaturally loud and shrill in the quiet. "What are your demands? Which side are you on?" Elias didn't stop. He didn't even look at the camera. He simply offered a small, sad smile and kept walking. The crowd behind him followed suit. They weren't ignoring the world. They were transcending it. They walked past the boarded-up windows. They walked past the lines of armed guards. They walked past the people screaming obscenities from the sidewalks. Why America didn't expect this in the United States? We are conditioned to believe that change is something that happens through friction. We believe that to be heard, you have to be louder than the person next to you. We have turned our political and social discourse into a professional wrestling match where the person who hits the hardest gets the most views. What America didn't expect was the power of refusal. This group was refusing to play the game. They weren't left, and they weren't right. By stripping away the slogans, the colors, and the chants. They forced everyone watching to look at the one thing we all have in common: our humanity. By the time the walk had covered just 4 blocks, the quiet had become a phenomenon. People were leaning out of office windows, their phones silenced, who's watching. The police began to lower their shields. The tension that had been felt in the teeth began to dissipate, replaced by a strange, heavy sense of awe. This wasn't a protest. This was a funeral for the division that had been killing the country. And as the line of walkers stretched for over a mile, the rest of the world began to realize that the loudest thing you can do in a screaming match is shut up and walk. As the line of quiet walkers moved deeper into the heart of Washington, D.C., they weren't just walking on asphalt. They were walking through a museum of American scars. Every intersection they crossed was a place where, only months or years prior, tear gas had hung in the air like a thick fog. Every monument they passed had been a backdrop for a shouting match. The organizers, this loose collective known as the Common Ground, knew exactly what they were doing. They chose a route that took them through the pressure points. They moved from the affluent business districts, where people watched from behind bulletproof glass, into the neighborhoods where the struggle for daily survival made peace feel like a luxury they could unafford. The media trucks followed them like vultures. The news anchors were frustrated. "They're still not talking," one correspondent whispered into his headset, his frustration visible on his face. "We've got 10,000 people in the street, and it's quieter than a library. There's no hook, there's no conflict." But the conflict was internal. It was happening inside the minds of everyone watching. The gauntlet of the angry about 2 miles into the trek. The walk hit its first major psychological hurdle. The gauntlet at the corner of K Street. A group of professional agitators had set up a noise wall. They had massive speakers, blasting distorted sirens, heavy metal, and looped recordings of political speeches played at ear-splitting volumes. They had megaphones. They had drums. They were there to break the silence. They wanted to provoke a reaction any. Reaction any. Reaction. A middle finger. A shout back. A defensive stance, anything that could be clipped into a 10-second video to prove that. These people are just like us. As Elias and the front line approached the noise, the air literally vibrated. The sound was designed to trigger the fight or flight response. It was an assault on the senses. But then, something miraculous happened. As the first walker reached the wall of noise, they didn't flinch. They didn't cover their ears. They didn't look at the agitators with disgust. Instead, they slowed their pace. They looked the screamers directly in the eye, not with defiance, but with a haunting, deep-seated recognition. It was the look you give a grieving relative who is lashing out in pain. The quiet walkers maintained their rhythm. Thud. 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 The sound of their feet, multiplied by thousands, began to create a counter-rhythm to the chaotic noise of the speakers. It was steady. It was predictable. It was grounded. One by one, the agitators with the megaphones began to falter. Their insults started to lose their edge. It's physically exhausting to stay angry at someone who refuses to be your enemy. One man, who had been screaming until his veins popped out of his neck, slowly lowered his megaphone. He looked at the diverse line of people, a mechanic, a lawyer, a grandmother, a teenager, and he saw his own reflection in their silence. He didn't join them, but he stopped screaming. He just watched them pass, his face a mask of profound confusion. The ghost in the machine, while the physical walk continued. A digital war was being waged. On social media, the ghost of conflict past was trying to pull the narrative back into the mud. Trolls and bots were flooding feeds with old footage of riots, trying to claim that this walk was a cover for something darker. Wait for the sun to go down, the comments read. They'll start burning things soon. Just see, wait. But the live streams told a different story. For the first time in the history of the internet, the quiet was more viral than the loud. People were tuning in just to hear the absence of noise. In offices across America, from Silicon Valley to the Rust Belt, people had the live feed on their second monitors. They weren't watching for the news. They were watching for the relief. There is a psychological phenomenon called mirror neurons. When we see someone in pain, we feel a shadow of that pain. When we see someone in a state of deep, focused peace, our own nervous systems begin to settle. The quiet walk was acting as a national sedative. The neighborhood of Echosta Walk, moved into a neighborhood that had been decimated by previous years of civil unrest. The boarded-up shops were covered in layers of graffiti, generations of anger, sprayed onto brick. Here, the residents didn't come out with cameras. They came out with suspicion. They stood on their porches, with their arms crossed. They had seen peace walks before. They had seen politicians come through with a trail of cameras, only to disappear once the polls closed. A young man, barely 20, stepped off his porch and walked right up to the line. He targeted an older man walking near the Ijam man who looked like he belonged in a corporate boardroom. "What are you doing here?" the young man challenged, his voice low and dangerous. "You think walking in silence fixes my empty fridge? You think this clears the bullet holes in my street?" The older man stopped. The line behind him stopped. There was a moment of absolute, terrifying tension. The police nearby moved their hands toward their belts. The older man didn't give a speech about policy. He didn't offer a platitude. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, crumpled photograph of a young man who looked remarkably like the one standing in front of him, and he held it to his chest. He had tears in his eyes. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said, "I have lost someone, too. I am here because I don't want to lose you." The young man stared at the photo. He looked at the older man's shaking hands. The anger didn't vanish, anger. That deep doesn't go away in a second, but the hostility evaporated. He stepped back. He didn't join the walk, but he gave a single, short nod. The line began to move again. The power of the unseen. By the end of this section of the journey, the quiet walk had become more than a protest. It had become a mirror. Every person who encountered it was forced to look at their own capacity for anger. The ghost of conflict past was the belief that we are defined by who we hate. The walk was proving that we are defined by what we can endure. They were walking through the graveyard of American discourse, and they were refusing to wake the dead. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, the bridge that would take them toward the monuments, the crowd had tripled in size. But the most incredible part, people weren't just joining to walk. They were joining to protect the silence. When a newcomer would join and try to start a chant, 5 strangers would gently put a finger to their lips. "Not here," they would whisper. Today, we let the silence do the talking. America didn't expect this because America had forgotten that silence is UNT void, it's a presence, and that presence was beginning to feel more powerful than any army. The walk had now reached the Arlington Memorial Bridge, a massive stone artery connecting the heart of the government to the rest of the country. This was the symbolic choke point. On one side lay the cemeteries of those who had died for the nation. On the other, the monuments to the men who had built it. The police had set up a secondary checkpoint here. They were nervous. Their intelligence reports hadn't prepared them for peace. They were used to measuring threats in terms of weapons, firecrackers, or chemical irritants. How do you measure the threat of 10,000 people who are making no sound? The commanding officer on the scene, a man who had seen 30 years of riots, stood on top of a cruiser with binoculars. He expected the group to break. He expected that under the blistering noon sun, with no water stations and no music to keep their spirits up, the quiet walkers would turn on each other. He expected the heat to boil over into frustration. But as the front of the line reached the bridge, something shifted. The walkers didn't look tired. They looked resolved. While the physical world watched the bridge, the digital world was experiencing a glitch in the narrative. The major news networks were in a panic. Their producers were screaming in control rooms. "Find me a fight. Find me someone saying something controversial. We're losing viewers because nothing is happening." One young field reporter, desperate for a moment, ran into the middle of the crowd. She began shouting questions at a woman in the middle of the lean, middle-aged mother holding a photo of her son. "Do you support the new legislation?" The reporter shoved the mic forward. "Are you here to protest the police? Do you hate the people on the other side?" The woman stopped. She didn't look at the camera. She looked at the reporter with a gaze so steady, so full of unexpressed grief and hope, that the reporter actually stepped back. The woman didn't say a word. She simply reached out and adjusted the reporter's crooked collar. A motherly gesture of care that felt like a lightning bolt in a world of hostility. The cameraman, caught off guard, didn't cut away. He stayed on the woman's face. For 45 seconds, an eternity in television time, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the look in that woman's eyes. In that 45 seconds, The narrative broke. The audience at home wasn't seeing a protester. They were seeing their own mother, their own sister, their own neighbor. The US versus them filter that the media had spent years building began to crack and crumble. At the center of the bridge, a group of about 50 hardline agitators had formed a human chain. These weren't just angry citizens. These were people whose entire identities were built on the conflict. They wore masks. They carried shields. They were prepared to be the villains in a story they thought they understood. As Elias and the front line reached to them, the air turned electric. The agitators began to scream directly into the faces of the walkers. They used the most polarizing language possible. They insulted their families, their beliefs, and their appearances. They were trying to vib-check the silence. One agitator, a young man fueled by adrenaline and ideology, grabbed Elias by the shoulders. "Hey, Kim, say something!" he screamed. "Defend yourself!" "Fight me." The world held its breath. The police reached for their batons. The drone cameras zoomed in. This was the shot everyone was waiting for, the first act of violence that would justify the deployment of the guard. Elias didn't fight back. He didn't even tense his muscles. He allowed himself to be shaken. And when the young man finally let go out of sheer exhaustion and confusion, Elias did the unthinkable. He sat down. He crossed his legs right there on the hot pavement of the bridge. Behind him, like a falling row of dominoes, the next 10 people sat. Then the next 100. Then the next 1,000. Within 3 minutes, the entire memorial bridge was covered in sitting human beings. The agitators were left standing, towering over a sea of seated, silent people. Their shields looked ridiculous. Their masks looked like costumes. In the face of such absolute vulnerability, their aggression had nowhere to go. It was like trying to punch a cloud. The leader of the agitators looked around. He saw a veteran in a wheelchair sitting next to a college kid. He saw an immigrant sitting next to a man in a tread on a hat. They weren't talking, but they were sharing the same space, to some a heat and the same silence. He dropped his shield. It hit the ground with a metallic clang that echoed across the water. He didn't sit down, not yet, but he stepped to the side. He cleared the path. One by one, his group followed. They didn't have a plan for this. Their enemy had disappeared, replaced by a mirror of themselves. The narrative wasn't just about politics. It was about the lie that Americans hate each other. As the walkers sat on that bridge, the millions watching online began to realize that the hate they saw on their screens every day was a manufactured product. Social media metrics showed a strange anomaly. The angry face emoji reactions on the live streams began to plummet, replaced by hearts and teardrops. The narrative of a country on the verge of civil war was being dismantled by the simple act of people sitting together in the sun. Elias stood up. He didn't check to see if anyone was following. He knew they were. He continued across the bridge, entering the sacred space of the Lincoln Memorial. The police, who had been briefed to expect a siege, began to open the barricades before the walkers even reached them. One officer was caught on a hot mic saying, "I don't know what this is, but it's the most American thing I've ever seen." The moment the narrative broke wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of 1,000,000 people simultaneously realizing they had been lied to about who their neighbors were. The bridge was crossed, not just the physical one, but the one between the heart and the head. The digital silence. While thousands were sitting on the bridge, millions were watching through the glowing glass of their smartphones. Usually, a viral event is defined by its noise, a punch thrown, a witty retort, a dramatic explosion. But as the quiet walk reached its peak, it did something the algorithms weren't programmed for. It created a digital vacuum. On platforms like TikTok and X, formerly Twitter, the trending topics usually move at a frantic, jagged pace. But on this afternoon, the For You pages across the globe began to settle into a singular, haunting loop. People weren't posting rants. They were posting 15-second clips of the silence. No music. No voiceovers, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of thousands of feet. The viral stillness became a form of digital meditation. People in Tokyo, London, and Mumbai were tuning in to watch Americanza. People the world usually sees as the loudest and most chaotic doing absolutely nothing but walking together. It was a glitch in the matrix of global culture. The death of the soundbite. In the air-conditioned newsrooms of New York and Atlanta, producers were having a collective nervous breakdown. The business model of modern news is built on the soundbite, a 10-second clip of someone saying something outrageous that can be played on a loop to generate anger and thus ad revenue. Give me a quote. A producer screamed into the earpiece of a reporter on the ground. Get someone to say they're demanding something. The reporter, a veteran journalist who had covered wars and elections, looked at the camera with a dazed expression. They won't speak, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've tried 20 people. They just smile and keep walking. It's like they've collectively decided that words are the problem. For the first time in the history of cable news, a major network went to a commercial break because they literally had nothing to report on. Yet their ratings were higher than they had been in years. People weren't watching to be informed. They were watching to be healed. The stillness was addictive. The algorithms confused. Inside the headquarters of the world's largest social media companies, the AI models were struggling to categorize the data. Usually, when an event goes viral, it's categorized by sentiment. Is it positive, angry, or negative? Fearful. But the quiet walk was neutral, profound. It didn't trigger the outrage engine. Because there was no enemy to attack, the trolls who usually dominate the comment sections found themselves with no ammunition. If they posted a hateful comment, it looked absurd next to a video of 1,000 people sitting in silence. It was like trying to start a fire in a room with no oxygen. A new hashtag began to emerge, unbidden and unmanufactured. Hashtag the big breathe. It wasn't a political slogan. It was an instruction. People began posting photos of themselves in their offices, in their cars, or in their kitchens, simply sitting still for 1 minute in solidarity with the walkers in DC. The viral stillness was no longer a spectator sport. It was a contagion of peace, the reflection at the pool. As the walkers reached the Lincoln Memorial and moved toward the reflecting pool, the visual imagery became too powerful for even the most cynical critics to ignore. The sun was hitting the water at a perfect angle, creating a mirror that doubled the size of the crowd. 50,000 people stood around the edges of the water. In any other era, this would have been the moment for a I have a dream style speech. The world was waiting for the leader to take the podium and claim the moment. Elias walked to the edge of the water. He didn't look for a microphone. He didn't look for a stage. He simply sat down on the marble edge and looked at his own reflection. One by one, the 50,000 followed. The viral stillness reached its zenith here. Drone shots from above showed a ring of humanity around the water. Perfectly still, perfectly quiet. It looked like a giant eye looking back at the sky. In that moment, a famous late-night talk show host, known for his biting political satire, did something he had never done. He went live on his YouTube channel, looked into the camera, and sat in silence for 5 minutes. No jokes. No monologue. Just him, looking at the lens, blinking back tears. He finally said, I think we've been shouting so loud we forgot what we were shouting about. The global echo. The stillness didn't stay in DC by 4 p.m. Reports started coming in from other cities. In Chicago, 1,000 people had gathered in Millennium Park and were sitting in silence. In Los Angeles, the hectic traffic of the 405 seemed too slow as people realized something was happening. In small towns in Kansas and Maine, people were walking to their town squares, not to argue, but to stand. The quiet walk had become a decentralized movement. It had no headquarters. It had no bank account. It had no manifesto. It was simply a collective realization that the noise of the world was a choice and we could choose to turn it off. The viral stillness proved that while hate is loud and fast, peace is deep and slow. The internet, which had been used for a decade to tear the country apart, was being used for one afternoon as a giant digital nervous system that was finally, blessedly, calming down. America didn't expect this because we had become a nation of content creators. We thought everything had to be content. We forgot that the most important parts of life are the parts that can be put into a caption. The quiet walk wasn't content. It was a consequence of a people who were finally, collectively, exhausted by the sound of their own voices. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges. The quiet walk didn't end with a bang or a firework display. There was no closing ceremony. There were no thank you speeches. Elias, the man in the white shirt, who had started it all, did something that baffled the modern world. Awoke Taway, while news crews scrambled to find him for an exclusive that would have been worth millions in sponsorships and book deals. Elias simply blended back into the crowd. He didn't post a selfie. He didn't start a mailing list. He walked to a nearby parking garage, got into a 10-year-old sedan, and drove back toward Ohio. By refusing to become a leader, Elias ensured that the movement couldn't be killed. You can't cancel a person who doesn't want fame. You can't discredit a leader who refuses to lead. He left the quiet walk as a gift to the people, rather than a platform for himself. This left the media in a vacuum. Without a protagonist to build up or tear down, they were forced to focus on the only thing left. The people who had walked the Monday morning. If the true test of any movement isn't what happens during the event, but what happens the next morning. On Wednesday, America woke up to a strange new reality. Usually, after a massive protest, the headlines are filled with arrest counts, damage estimates, and who won analysis. But on this Wednesday, the headlines were quiet. The quiet walk had resulted in 0 arrests. There wasn't a single broken window. There wasn't even any litter. The walkers had carried their trash out with them in total silence, in corporate offices. The usual morning bickering over the outrage of the day felt stale. People found it harder to be mean to their colleagues after watching 50,000 people sit in silence on a bridge. A strange empathy hangover had settled over the country. Data analysts later noted a statistical anomaly in the 48 hours following the walk. Online harassment reports on major platforms dropped by nearly 30%. Customer service representatives reported fewer abusive calls. It was as if the country had collectively realized it had been screaming for years and had finally developed a sore throat. The science of the silent psychologists began calling it the Elias effect. They studied how the walk had bypassed the amygdala hijack, the brain's tendency to go into fight or flight mode when faced with conflict. By removing the shouting, the walkers had removed the threat signal. The walk had forced the nation's collective brain to switch from the amygdala, the center of fear and anger, to the prefrontal cortex, the center of logic and empathy. It was a mass neurological reset. Schools began implementing quiet minutes before classes. Some tech companies even experimented with silent meetings, realizing that the most productive work often happened when the ego was forced to sit down. The empty podium. A month after the walk, a major political convention was held. Usually, these events are theaters of noise balloons, cheering, and aggressive rhetoric. But when the first speaker took the stage to launch a standard attack on the other side, the crowd's reaction was different. They didn't boo, they didn't cheer. They just sat there. The silence of the quiet walk had become a tool for the average citizen. It was a new way to say, "We aren't buying this anymore." The politicians, who were trained to thrive on the energy of a crowd, were left floundering. You can't use rallying cries when the people refuse to be rattled. The quiet walk had effectively taught America that their attention was their most valuable resource. By refusing to give their attention to the noise, they had reclaimed their power. The legacy of the white shirt years later, people still talk about the day the shouting stopped. The quiet walk didn't solve every problem. It didn't end poverty, it didn't fix the climate, and it didn't eliminate prejudice. But it did prove one vital truth. Conflict is a choice. The quiet walk became a blueprint for a new kind of activism. Whenever the tension in a city reached a breaking point, a few people would put on plain white shirts and start walking in silence. It became a safety valve for the national psyche. It was a reminder that we are not just voters, or consumers, or users on an app. We are human beings who breathe the same air and walk the same earth. Conclusion. The question for you as this story goes viral on your screen, and as you prepare to scroll to the next video or write your next comment, the quiet walk asks you one final, haunting question. In a world that is designed to keep you angry, loud, and distracted, do you have the courage to be quiet? America didn't expect a quiet walk for peace to change the world. They expected fire. They expected fury, but they found out that while fire can burn things down, only the quiet can build them back up. The man in the white shirt is gone, The silence on the bridge has been replaced by the roar of traffic, but the memory remains. The next time you feel the urge to scream into the digital void, remember Elias. Remember the bridge. Remember that the most powerful thing you can do is listen.